In the profound silence of the convent, the sound of the bells echoed like a reminder of the absolute surrender that young Beatriz had made before God. Her name was Beatriz, and her clear eyes carried the serenity of one who had renounced the world to live only for faith. From a very early age, Beatriz believed her mission was devotion, prayer, and purity. She wore the habit with pride, for every thread of that garment represented protection against the temptations of the outside world. The convent was a place of discipline, where time seemed not to pass, marked only by the sunrise and sunset of prayers. Yet behind the tranquility of the white walls, there was a hidden weight, a secret locked away that would forever change the fate of the novice. Beatriz was not just an ordinary novice. Her entrance into the convent was tied to a debt of blood, a pact made by her family with powerful people who financed the institution. The young woman never knew the details, only obeyed the spiritual calling, believing it was her vocation. But on the night before the day she was to take her final vows, a mysterious man dressed in a black suit appeared at the convent gate. He asked for no permission, only delivered a sealed letter to the Mother Superior, who paled as she read it. The letter declared that Beatriz could not complete her vows. Instead, she was to leave the convent immediately and marry an influential billionaire, heir to a foundation that sustained charitable works but hid far darker interests. When the young woman was called into the Mother Superior's office, her heart pounded. She had never seen the Superior so unsettled. "Daughter, there is something you must understand. Your life does not belong only to you. There are debts that must be paid." Beatriz could not comprehend. The words cut like blades. How could she be forced to break her promise to God? Silently weeping, she heard the rest of the revelation. If she refused the marriage, the foundation would withdraw all support from the convent, leaving dozens of orphans without shelter or future. It was cruel blackmail. The convent that had welcomed her, the girls who depended on that home, everything was in her hands. Through tears, Beatriz walked into the chapel and knelt before the altar. Her body trembled, her faith faltered. The cross before her seemed too heavy to bear. "Lord, if this is the path, show me how not to lose you amidst the world," she whispered in prayer, as her tears fell on the cold marble. It was the promise of faith against the weight of the revealed secret. For the first time, Beatriz felt that heaven was silent, and fate, merciless, was knocking at her door. The midnight bell announced that her life as a novice was coming to an end, not by her own will, but by the imposition of greater forces. Outside, a black limousine awaited, as if the secular world had come to claim her with no right of refusal. The young woman knew that as soon as she crossed that gate, she would leave behind the purity of her promise and step into an unknown path, marked by a forced marriage, where her faith would be tested before a man who believed in nothing but power and wealth. Beatriz felt each step as if it were her last inside the convent. The cold wind of dawn caressed her face while the limousine waited, imposing like a portal between two worlds, devotion and temptation. Inside the car, a driver with a stern expression did not utter a single word. He merely opened the door and waited for her to get in. The silence was unsettling. As she settled into the soft leather seat, Beatriz realized she had never felt so much fear. Not of the unknown, but of herself, of the possibility of losing the faith that had been the foundation of her life. The city unfolded before her eyes like a spectacle of lights, violently contrasting with the shadowed quiet of the convent left behind. Each illuminated building seemed to mock her fragility, as if the world itself whispered that she had no choice. The limousine brought her to a monumental mansion, surrounded by high walls and golden gates. It was a modern palace, cold and dazzling, but devoid of warmth. The doors opened and there he was, Alessandro, the billionaire who was to become her husband. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a commanding posture, he wore an impeccable suit that radiated power. His dark eyes studied Beatriz with coldness, as one might observe a rare object rather than a person. He did not smile, nor did he welcome her. He merely extended his hand to lead her inside, and that simple gesture was enough to make her feel as though she was stepping into a luxurious cage. The main hall of the mansion resembled a tribunal. Upon the glass table, a thick contract rested, surrounded by lawyers and witnesses who regarded her with indifference. Beatriz felt the weight of the paper before even touching it. The document declared in cold, impersonal letters that the marriage would be immediate, irrevocable, and valid not only as a conjugal union, but also as part of a corporate arrangement involving the foundation. Her signature was demanded not as a wife, but as a cog in a calculated mechanism. Alessandro, standing, watched her with a fixed gaze, almost challenging her to resist. "Do you have any objection?" he asked, his deep voice echoing through the hall like a sentence. Beatriz swallowed hard, her lips trembling, but no words emerged. The orphans in the convent, the blackmail, her torn faith, all whirled in her mind like a storm. With trembling hands, she grasped the pen and signed. The scratching of the nib against the paper resounded like a muffled cry of her soul. When she lifted her eyes, Alessandro stepped closer and murmured, "Welcome to my world, wife." The formal kiss that sealed the contract carried neither tenderness nor passion. It was cold, almost mechanical, like a stamp upon a transaction. For Beatriz, that moment confirmed her fall. The vow of chastity she had guarded so carefully was now tainted by an agreement born not of love, but of manipulation and greed. At the same time, a spark of resistance was lit within her. If fate had placed her there, then she would need to find a way to transform her prison into purpose. Little did she know that this contract, born of imposed sin, would become the key to uncovering secrets far darker, haunting not only the foundation but also the man with whom she now shared both a name and a life. The first night in the mansion was a shock for Beatriz. Accustomed to the profound silence of the convent walls, where only the sound of prayers and footsteps echoed, she now found herself surrounded by long corridors, crystal chandeliers illuminating every corner, and an opulence that seemed to scream excess. The room assigned to her was larger than the entire dormitory she once shared with the other novices. A bed with silk sheets, heavy curtains blocking out the light, sweet perfumes lingering in the air. Yet no luxury could warm the solitude that spread throughout the space. For Beatriz, every detail was not a symbol of comfort, but of captivity. The silence here was not sacred, it was suffocating, as if the gilded walls themselves were watching her, reminding her that her life was no longer her own. The following morning, she was not awakened by the chapel bell, but by a stern housekeeper who handed her a wardrobe filled with expensive dresses, light fabrics, daring colors, high heels that seemed like objects from another planet for someone who had only known the habit and simplicity. "Mr. Alessandro wishes you to be presentable for tonight's dinner with the foundation's investors," said the woman, leaving no room for objections. Beatriz touched the dresses hesitantly, as if touching fire, sensing that each garment was another layer stripped from her identity. To dress in such a way was also to wear the world that rejected her, that mocked her faith, and that now demanded she learn to survive behind masks. The contrast was brutal. In the convent, meals were served in simple bowls, shared in silence. In the mansion, long tables were adorned with lavish banquets, expensive wines, and conversations steeped in cynicism. Beatriz, seated beside her husband, tried to maintain her composure, but she felt the stares of high society undressing her with silent judgment. Whispers drifted through the hall. Who is this naive girl? Where did he find her? To them, she was an exotic piece, perhaps a passing whim of Alessandro. But to Beatriz, each word was a wound, a reminder that she was there as a hostage to a contract, not as a wife by choice. Even so, the mansion harbored secrets that both fascinated and terrified her. There were forbidden corridors, locked doors, rooms no one dared to mention. And amidst the luxury, the shadow of the foundation always loomed, a constant theme in Alessandro's conversations with his partners. Beatriz listened in silence, but she already sensed that the entity presenting itself as philanthropic concealed something much greater. It was as if her entry into this world was not only a punishment, but also a mission she had yet to understand. In this violent transition from cloister to luxury, Beatriz began to realize that her faith would be tested in ways she had never imagined. The temptations were not merely in touch or in desires her vow of chastity sought to suppress. The true temptations were power, vanity, and the lies that now surrounded her. And above all, the figure of Alessandro himself, who, with his intense presence, awakened in her sensations that not even hours of prayer had ever managed to erase. Beatriz, still lost between the memory of the silent cloister and the imposing routine of the mansion, began to feel in her heart the inevitable collision between two worlds. It was as if every gesture, every word, every glance reminded her that her life now stood on profane ground. Alessandro, for his part, made no effort to hide his disdain for the faith she carried so deeply in her heart. During breakfast, he would watch her discreetly make the sign of the cross before eating and smile with cruel sarcasm. "Do you really think someone is listening to your prayers, Beatriz?" he would murmur, raising a glass of wine early in the morning, as if the day had no rules. To him, religion was nothing but an invention to imprison the weak, and he never missed a chance to remind her of it. With each encounter, the distance between them seemed to grow, but it was precisely this tension that ignited the moments they shared. Beatriz felt his presence like a storm, strong, inevitable, dangerous. Alessandro walked through the mansion with the certainty of one who knew he owned the world, and his deep voice always seemed to carry a bitter truth that challenged everything she believed in. To him, God was nothing more than a convenient silence, a ghost invented to justify renunciations. To her, God was all she had left, the only refuge in the face of the new life forced upon her. Arguments began to grow more frequent. Alessandro provoked, and she responded firmly, though trembling inside. "Faith is the only reason I'm still standing," she declared one evening, during a dinner where he mocked the prayers she insisted on saying before bed. The billionaire leaned over the table, his eyes burning like embers, and replied coldly, "The only reason you're still standing is because I allow it. The rest are illusions that save no one." Those words wounded her, but also awakened something new, a spark of defiance, a desire to prove that her faith was not weakness, but strength. Even in his most cynical moments, Alessandro seemed intrigued by Beatriz's conviction. He saw in her something he had never encountered in any other woman in his life, an unexpected resistance, a gaze that would not bow before his power. What began as mockery slowly turned into curiosity, and though he would never admit it, at times he felt small in the presence of the serenity she carried in her heart. Beatriz, meanwhile, fought a secret war. Between her prayers and the weight of repressed desire, she began to realize that her faith was challenged not only by words, but by the intensity of a man who denied God, yet awakened in her feelings she had never allowed herself to experience. This coexistence became an invisible battlefield. Beatriz's faith was her armor, but Alessandro's cynicism was a blade that cut mercilessly. And deep down, they both knew that this clash did not push them apart. It drew them ever closer into a dangerous tension where love and hate, devotion and disbelief were destined to intertwine until no boundaries remained. The tension between Beatriz and Alessandro grew each day like a rope stretched to its limit, ready to snap. The vow of chastity she carried as a shield began to be tested in unexpected situations, in subtle gestures, and in moments where the body betrayed the mind. Alessandro seemed to know exactly where to touch, how to provoke, how to test the resistance of the young woman who tried to keep her eyes fixed on the heavens, but could no longer hide the trembling of her hands in his presence. He didn't need bold words. It was enough to draw closer, to let his deep voice brush against her ears, to hold her gaze with burning intensity until it seared like fire. One gala night, Beatriz was forced to accompany him to a business dinner, dressed in a silk gown that made her uncomfortable, yet dazzling in the eyes of all. She felt her skin burn under the weight of others' stares. Alessandro, noticing her unease, leaned in and murmured, "You dress in holiness, but you were born to be seen." The words struck her like sin itself, and Beatriz felt her heart race. That evening, while guests toasted and laughed, she waged a secret war against herself, against the flame beginning to burn in a body that was meant to belong only to God. There were also more intimate moments when Alessandro invaded her personal space without asking. A brief touch as he passed his hand along her waist, a firm grip on the back of her neck to force her to meet his eyes, or the warmth of his breath when, deliberately, he leaned close enough for her to feel the danger of falling. Beatriz, though trying to resist, realized her breathing grew shallow, her body reacting in ways she could not control. It was as if the vow of chastity, once unshakable, began to crack under the weight of the desire Alessandro awakened. But the trials were not only physical. Alessandro constantly placed her in moral dilemmas. At a dinner, before investors, he openly mocked Beatrice's faith, asking her to pray aloud just to laugh at her. Beatrice, her face burning, closed her eyes and prayed silently, ignoring the laughter that echoed around the table. When she finished, she opened her eyes to find Alessandro watching her with a mix of disdain and admiration. "You are stubborn, girl," he said in a low voice, "and perhaps that is why I cannot take my eyes off you." These trials were constant, and each one left invisible scars upon her soul. Beatrice no longer knew if she was fighting Alessandro, the world, or herself. What she did know was that something inside her was changing every day, that her faith remained her light, but now it intertwined with something human, earthly, dangerous. Temptation was not only an enemy, it was a mirror, showing her a side of herself she had never known. And in Alessandro's gaze, however cynical, a different fire began to emerge. Not only provocation, but a desire mixed with curiosity, respect, and something he himself did not want to admit: fascination. Beatriz had already understood that Alessandro was not merely a cold and cynical man, but someone scarred by shadows no one dared to mention. Little by little, between provocations and silences, fragments of his past began to surface, like pieces of a puzzle, revealing the true reason behind his disbelief in faith. One night, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he found her praying in the mansion's garden. The moonlight bathed her face, and Alessandro silently observed her for a few moments before interrupting with a voice heavy with something that sounded more like pain than mockery. "Do you really believe God hears that? If he did, my life would not have been destroyed." Beatrice did not answer immediately. She only looked at him with the serenity she always carried. Then Alessandro, between sips of whiskey, began to speak. He told her about a childhood marked by the absence of love, about the mother who died young, and about the father, an implacable man who knew only business and power. Alessandro grew up surrounded by wealth but deprived of affection, as if he were nothing more than another investment in the family lineage. With each memory, his voice swayed between anger and sorrow. He also revealed the loss of a woman he had once loved, who died under mysterious circumstances he still carried as an open wound. "I begged God to save her, and he remained silent," he said, his eyes fixed on the void. For Beatrice, every word was a painful revelation. The arrogant man who challenged her so often was not driven solely by contempt for faith, but by the wounds of a heart that had never known comfort. His skepticism was not pure arrogance, it was an armor forged to avoid suffering again. Beatrice began to realize that behind the cold billionaire stood a broken man who rejected faith not out of indifference, but out of profound disappointment. That past explained not only his cynicism, but also his obsession with control and power. It was the way he had found to ensure he would never feel fragile again. Yet, in exposing his wounds, Alessandro also drew closer to her in an unexpected way. Beatrice's gaze, compassionate yet steady, did not judge him. For the first time, he did not see pity, but genuine understanding. This contrast unsettled him. He was used to everyone around him bowing before his strength, never to someone perceiving his vulnerability without exploiting it. "You don't understand, Beatrice. The world isn't made for those who believe in miracles. It's made for those who take what they want," she replied with a calm voice. "Or perhaps the world needs those who refuse to stop believing." That dialogue marked the beginning of a silent change between them. Beatrice no longer saw only the arrogant billionaire, but the wounded man who hid his scars behind sarcasm and contracts. And Alessandro, against his own will, began to wonder if that novice torn from the convent might be the only person capable of seeing beyond the masks, perhaps even of giving back to him something he believed he had lost forever: hope. The days in the mansion began to grow stranger for Beatrice. Between the luxurious dinners, the meetings with investors, and the judgmental glances of high society, something began to catch her attention: the foundation she had inherited through marriage. At first, Alessandro spoke little of it, treating the matter as just another cog in his business life. But Beatriz, accustomed to the simplicity and clarity of the convent, could not ignore the numbers that made no sense, the documents discreetly circulating among lawyers and businessmen, and the tense expressions that always arose whenever the topic surfaced. One afternoon, while wandering alone through the mansion's forbidden corridors, she discovered a file room. It was a silent library, but without books of faith or history, only folders, contracts, and foundation reports. Driven by curiosity, she began leafing through some documents. She soon noticed grotesque discrepancies, donations that never reached their promised destination, social projects registered on paper, but non-existent in reality. Her heart pounded as she realized that this entity, paraded as philanthropic, might be nothing more than a facade for something far darker. Her unease deepened when Beatriz found a report hidden in a locked drawer. The document described massive expenditures on shelter centers, yet there were no concrete records of where they were located or who benefited from them. The figures were exorbitant and all bore signatures of people she had never heard of. There were also vague mentions of transit programs and emergency transfers, cold terms that did not match the language of charity. It was as if she was staring at a code, something carefully disguised. Frightened, Beatriz brought the matter to Alessandro. Instead of clear answers, she found only coldness and evasion. "This is none of your concern," he said, slamming the folder shut before her. "Learn not to stick your nose where it doesn't belong." But the sharpness in his voice sounded more like fear than authority. From that moment, Beatriz was certain that something terrible lay behind the institution. The foundation, which was supposed to sustain orphans and relief projects, concealed a dark purpose, and her heart already suspected the truth. The money financed crimes. This discovery was like a flame reigniting the determination in her soul. For the first time, Beatriz felt that perhaps fate had pulled her from the convent, not only to test her, but to place her exactly where she was needed. Her mission was no longer merely to endure an imposed marriage or to preserve her faith amid Alessandro's cynicism. Her mission now was to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The novice torn away from her sacred life was beginning to transform into a woman of courage, ready to confront secrets that could destroy her, but also might save many lives. From the moment she uncovered the inconsistencies in the Foundation's reports, Beatriz began to see the world around her with different eyes. The mansion's luxury, the lavish banquets, and the expensive dresses no longer dazzled her perception. All of it was sustained by something dirty, something growing like a shadow behind appearances. What haunted her most was not just financial fraud, but the cold terms such as emergency transfers and transit programs, which increasingly sounded like euphemisms for illegal activities. Each line she read seemed like a whisper from the darkness, denouncing that lives were being traded like numbers on a spreadsheet. These whispers took form when Beatriz, at a private high society dinner, overheard conversations among men with respectable appearances. They spoke of delicate merchandise, safe routes, and silent partnerships. Though the words were carefully chosen to sound technical, their cold, complicit gazes left no doubt. It was something linked to human trafficking. Beatriz's heart clenched when she realized that the donations meant to save orphans were, in truth, financing the trade of innocence. She tried once again to warn Alessandro, but met the same barrier as always: irony and evasions. "You're imagining too much, wife," he said, lighting a cigar and averting his eyes. Yet in the depths of his gaze there was a strange glimmer, a silent rage that intrigued her. It was as though he too knew of the rot but was not ready to reveal it. That silence only reinforced in Beatriz the feeling that she was entangled in a dangerous game, where one misplaced word could cost her life. Each day, her faith was tested not only by repressed desire and her forced marriage, but also by the weight of secretly carrying evidence of a criminal network. The convent, with its white walls and predictable routine, now seemed like a distant paradise. Here in the mansion, every dark corridor, every suspicious glance from the servants, every conversation suddenly cut short became proof that corruption was not only in the papers, but steeped in the very atmosphere of the house. Beatriz began to realize she could no longer trust anyone. The stern housekeeper who always watched her, the lawyers who circulated through the mansion, even the frequent guests all seemed part of a machinery that turned in silence. The whispers were everywhere, in the reports, in the conversations, in the glances. And deep down, what frightened her most was the certainty that she was approaching something that could no longer be ignored. It was not merely a corrupted foundation. It was a network of power so deep it could swallow anyone who dared to expose it. Beatriz's life had become a tightrope. On one side, the unbearable weight of the discovery about the foundation, which placed upon her the responsibility to act in order to save innocent lives. On the other, the presence of Alessandro, who provoked her, challenged her, and at the same time awakened in her feelings she had never imagined experiencing outside the cloister. Duty screamed within her soul, reminding her of her spiritual mission, but her heart began to beat to a rhythm that did not obey the rules of faith. With every exchanged glance, with every unexpected closeness, Beatriz realized she was no longer fighting only against the corruption of an institution, but against the fire burning within herself. Alessandro, though he tried to keep his mask of cynicism, also began to change. Beatriz noticed it in almost imperceptible details: the way he lingered a second longer when looking at her, the way he lowered his tone of voice when speaking to her, the way he seemed unsettled when their eyes met. The man who mocked her faith, who treated their marriage as a contract, was now showing cracks in his armor. There were nights when he silently accompanied her while she prayed in the garden, pretending indifference but unable to walk away. And although he would never admit it, his provocations now carried not only sarcasm, but also a need to remain near her. This dilemma tore Beatriz apart. Faith taught her that love should be born pure, blessed, not born from blackmail and cold contracts. Yet at the same time, there was something in Alessandro that drew her in inexplicably. It was not only physical desire, though that was becoming harder and harder to contain, but also a calling to see in him the wounded man who tried to hide his pain behind arrogance. Duty urged her to remain strong, to stay distant, and to focus on unraveling the web of corruption. But her heart, fragile and human, begged for a touch, for a gesture of tenderness that would free her from the solitude she had carried since leaving the convent. One night, after another tense meeting about the foundation, Alessandro entered her room without knocking. Beatriz rose in alarm, but before she could say anything, he only stared at her in silence. There was no sarcasm, no irony, only a weary, vulnerable, almost pleading look. In that moment, Beatriz understood that he too was fighting his own internal battle, between the duty of maintaining control and the desire to surrender. The tension between them became unbearable, as though a greater force pushed them toward one another. And even though Beatriz fought to keep her distance, her body and soul already knew that the path between love and duty was about to cross at a point of no return. The night was steeped in silence when everything happened. Beatriz had withdrawn to the mansion's library, one of the few places where she could breathe amidst the luxurious corridors that felt like gilded cages. She leafed through an old book, trying to find on the printed page the serenity she once found in the scriptures of the convent, but her mind was not there. It was filled with memories of Alessandro, his intense glances, his provocations oscillating between cruelty and desire, and above all that recent silence, heavy with something that had left her confused. The novice's heart beat faster, as if sensing that something was about to break the fragile line that separated faith from temptation. Then he appeared without warning, slowly opening the door. Alessandro entered the room with firm steps, but there was no arrogance in his gaze that night. He observed her for a few seconds, as if battling something within himself, until he finally broke the silence. "You managed to take me out of control, Beatriz, and I hate it." She, surprised, tried to respond, but her voice failed. The man who always mocked her faith now seemed stripped of his masks, revealing the vulnerability of someone who no longer knew where cynicism ended and desire began. Alessandro approached slowly, each step echoing like thunder in Beatriz's chest. She backed away until she pressed against the bookshelf, the book falling from her hands like a symbol of a battle she could no longer fight. "Tell me to leave, and I will," he murmured, his deep voice resonating like both a promise and a threat. But no words came. Beatriz, paralyzed between fear and surrender, only stared at him, feeling the air grow thinner between them. It was then that Alessandro, unable to resist, gently held her face in his hands and kissed her. The kiss was not cold or formal like the one at the contract. It was intense, deep, charged with desire restrained through endless nights. For Beatriz, it was as if the entire world collapsed and, at the same time, rebuilt itself in a single instant. Her mind screamed, reminding her of the vow of chastity, the altar, the promise made to God. But her body burned, responding with fervor, as if that touch were the only thing capable of giving her life again. The purity she had so zealously protected shattered in silence, not as sin, but as revelation, that she was made of flesh, of soul, and of love. When their lips parted, Beatriz was breathless, her heart racing like never before. Alessandro looked at her with dark, blazing eyes, and in his voice there was something he had never confessed before. "I've never kissed anyone like this, as if my life depended on it." She, trembling, brought her hand to her lips, still feeling the warmth of the gesture that had changed everything. There was no turning back. The vow was broken, and with it, the certainties that had sustained her until then. The kiss, born of temptation, now placed her before a greater dilemma. Could true love exist within a forced marriage and a web of corruption? The answer was not yet clear, but in that moment, Beatriz understood that her mission would not be merely to survive that fate. It would be to face herself, her faith, and the love that had begun to grow where it never should have taken root. The kiss had torn down the wall that separated Beatriz from Alessandro, but it had also opened the doors to a new and painful truth. There was no longer only the tension between faith and desire. Now there was the shadow of the corruption surrounding the foundation, looming over them like a storm about to erupt. It was on a grey morning, while leafing through more documents hidden in a forgotten folder, that Beatriz found irrefutable evidence. They were coded reports, yet clear enough to reveal a cruel reality. The foundation was not only embezzling resources, it was financing an international human trafficking network. Children and teenagers were taken from their homes under the pretense of social projects, never to return. The impact made her body tremble. She felt nauseous. Tears fell from her eyes, and for an instant, she wished she could return to being the cloistered novice, protected by the convent walls. But the truth could not be ignored. Her heart cried out for the orphans at risk, for the girls who had already disappeared, for the whispers of pain hidden between the lines of those reports. The spiritual duty she thought she had left behind now was reborn stronger than ever. She had been torn from religious life, but God had placed her exactly where she needed to be, in the center of the enemy. When she decided to confront Alessandro with the evidence, she expected denial, anger, or sarcasm. But what she found was something even more surprising: complicity. He already knew. Alessandro was not only aware of the rot behind the foundation, he had been investigating it in silence, waiting for the right moment to act. "Do you think I didn't notice the dirty hands we inherited along with this money?" he said, his voice heavy with contained fury. "My family built an empire on a facade of philanthropy, but what sustained it all was the worst kind of modern slavery. I entered this marriage not just out of pressure, Beatriz. I needed someone on the inside, someone who could see what I could no longer see alone." Beatriz was speechless. The revelation shook all her certainties. Until then, she had believed herself to be alone in that fight, but now she discovered that the very man who had challenged her so much was also an enemy of that network. It was not coincidence. It was not chance. Their lives had been intertwined for something greater. But Alessandro, unlike her, did not carry faith or compassion. His motivation was vengeance. He wanted to destroy the system that had taken lives, that had stained his family's name, and that had turned his very existence into a labyrinth of corruption. This revelation brought them even closer. The kiss that had broken the vow now became a symbol of an unexpected alliance. Two opposite worlds, faith and disbelief, purity and vengeance, united by the same objective: to expose the dark network that fed on innocence. But this new truth also brought with it a greater burden: the certainty that they were in danger, surrounded by enemies who would not hesitate to destroy anyone daring to challenge them. Beatriz, with her faith rekindled, lifted her eyes to Alessandro and said, "If God placed me here, it was to save those girls. But if you step onto this path, you must understand it will not only be blood and vengeance, it will be sacrifice, and it may cost us our lives." He looked at her with seriousness, and for the first time there was no sarcasm in his voice. Then we go to the end. After Alessandro's revelation, Beatrice's life took an even more dangerous course. If before she had felt alone in the face of the Foundation's darkness, now she knew she had by her side a man who, even burdened with disbelief and fury, shared the same mission, dismantling the trafficking network. But it was impossible for them to face it alone. The Foundation had long arms, political connections, corrupted police officers, and businessmen willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. They needed to find allies, people who dared to fight against the impossible. The first one came from where Beatriz least expected, the mansion's own housekeeper. A rigid woman of few words, who for weeks had seemed like nothing more than another watchful guardian of the luxurious prison. But on a silent night, when Beatriz once again risked investigating the hidden files, she was surprised by the woman. Instead of denouncing her, the housekeeper locked the door and whispered, "I know what you're looking for, and I want to help." Her tearful eyes revealed the pain of someone who had already lost a loved one to the network, a niece who had disappeared, taken away under the false promise of care by the very Foundation. Since then, she had worked in the mansion in silence, waiting for the right moment to take her revenge. Another unexpected ally came from outside, a discredited investigative journalist who had spent years trying to prove the Foundation's involvement in international crimes. He had been silenced, his articles destroyed, and his career ruined. But when Beatriz and Alessandro met him in a hidden cafe on the outskirts of the city, he saw in those documents a chance not only to rebuild his reputation, but also to restore justice. "You have no idea of the magnitude of this. We are talking about a global network," he said, adjusting his glasses and gathering the papers with trembling hands. Even within Alessandro's circle of power, allies emerged. One of the family's lawyers, long uncomfortable with the illegal practices he witnessed, offered secret information in exchange for protection. "I can't sleep anymore knowing what these contracts hide," he confessed in a low voice, as he handed over a folder filled with records of illegal transfers. Each name, each figure, each signature was a piece completing the puzzle of horror. These allies formed a silent army, each driven by their own pain, guilt, and loss. For Beatriz, it was proof that God had not abandoned her. He was sending people, angels hidden amidst corruption, to help her fulfill her mission. Alessandro, on the other hand, saw it with pragmatism. They are not angels, they are pieces, and we must use them wisely. But even he knew deep down that without these unexpected companions, they would stand no chance against the Foundation's dark empire. With every ally gained, the risk also grew. Beatriz knew that if they were discovered, there would be no mercy. But within her, the conviction was growing that she was no longer fighting only for herself, nor just for Alessandro. She was fighting for every missing girl, for every innocent turned into a number on a spreadsheet. And this mission, though dangerous, was already beginning to unite hearts and destinies in a way no forced contract ever could. The discoveries and alliances had transformed Beatriz into a woman utterly different from the novice who once lived cloistered in the convent. If before her faith had been made of silence and obedience, now it had become a flame burning amid darkness, guiding her along a path where every step demanded courage. But that same path forced her to make sacrifices that tore her soul apart. For the first time, Beatriz felt that the purity of her vows no longer belonged to her. Her body, once consecrated to the altar, now surrendered to the warmth of Alessandro. Her heart, which should have beat only for God, now pounded wildly before a man marked by disbelief. And yet, she did not feel only sin, but purpose. Every time she knelt in prayer, tears fell from her eyes, not out of repentance, but out of anguish. She asked herself whether she was betraying her faith or, in truth, fulfilling a greater calling, to be an instrument of God amid chaos. Her struggle was no longer only against carnal temptations, but against the guilt that consumed her. And yet, it was that very faith that strengthened her in the face of the network of power that threatened to kill her at any moment. It was as if God was testing her, demanding from her not only the renunciation of innocence, but also the sacrifice of her own spiritual peace in the name of a greater good. Alessandro noticed her conflict, even without understanding her devotion. One night, He found her crying in the mansion's chapel, kneeling before a small cross she had secretly brought with her. He approached in silence, and for the first time did not mock her. He simply stood by her side, respecting the moment. When she lifted her tearful eyes, Alessandro murmured, "You teach me to believe without realizing it. But sometimes I think your faith destroys you, as much as it strengthens you." Those words became engraved in Beatriz's mind. Could it be true? Was her faith a light or a burden? With every new step in the fight against the foundation, she had to detach herself more and more from the life she once had. The novice who had taken vows of chastity was dead, and in her place was born a woman who carried both the cross and the fire of a forbidden love. It was this love that gave her strength to face their enemies, but it was also what pulled her away from the sacred life she had chosen. This sacrifice was no small one. It was the renunciation of her identity, of the purity that had defined her, in exchange for a greater mission. Deep down, Beatriz knew she would never be the same again. Her faith was no longer an untouched wall, but a battlefield marked by scars. Even so, she did not give up. If she had to lose herself to save the innocent, so be it. Her sacrifice was also her offering to God, not the blind obedience of a cloistered novice, but the courageous surrender of a woman who had decided to fight until the end. The foundation, once wrapped in glory and speeches of philanthropy, began to crumble under the weight of the evidence gathered by Beatriz, Alessandro, and their allies. Every document, every testimony, every diverted sum became a weapon against the empire of corruption. The discredited journalist, now strengthened by Beatriz's courage, assembled a robust dossier ready to be delivered to the authorities and the press. The repentant lawyer provided secret contracts and recordings of meetings that exposed the network's leaders, and the housekeeper, with tears and courage, opened the mansion's darkest files, revealing transport routes and the names of accomplices. The plot that once seemed unbreakable began to yield, and the whispers of corruption turned into shouts of denunciation. But it was not easy. At every step, new threats emerged: tapped phones, silent pursuits, and even veiled attacks against Beatriz, who barely escaped an ambush on a deserted road. Alessandro, realizing the danger, tightened his protection. But there was no way to stop the tide. The truth now ran like a raging river, impossible to contain. And it was during a press conference broadcast worldwide that the young woman, once a novice, raised her voice. Dressed simply, but with dignity and tact, Beatriz recounted everything she had uncovered. She denounced names, described methods, showed indisputable evidence. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from indignation and compassion for the invisible victims who finally gained a face and a voice. At her side, Alessandro remained silent, allowing Beatriz to take the lead. He knew that this fight was not only his, but above all, hers. The man who once saw her as a contractual object now looked at her as a leader, as a living flame that illuminated even his disbelief. At the height of the conference, Beatriz declared firmly, "I was torn from a life of silence and prayer to be thrown into a forced marriage. But I discovered that my duty was not only to my vows, but to the truth. And the truth is this: this foundation, sustained by money and power, was buying and destroying lives. Today, in the name of faith, in the name of justice, and in the name of the girls who could not speak, I say enough." The room erupted in murmurs. Cameras flashed incessantly, and authorities could no longer ignore what stood before them. Arrests were ordered, assets were frozen, and the leaders of the network began to be hunted down. The victory was not only legal or political, it was moral and spiritual. The courage of a woman who once had promised herself to the silence of the convent now echoed throughout the world. For Beatriz, there was no personal triumph. There was relief, pain, and sacrifice. She knew wounds remained, victims yet unfound, memories of suffering that could never be erased. But on that day, she was certain her sacrifice had not been in vain. The vow of chastity was lost, innocence was broken, but in its place something greater had been born: the conviction that God was not confined to the walls of a convent, but present in every act of courage to defend the defenseless. After the public denunciation, the lives of Beatriz and Alessandro were never the same again. The foundation was dismantled, those involved were judged and punished, and the rescued girls finally found refuge in new homes, freed from the invisible chains that bound them. But within the intimacy of the mansion, a new challenge arose, redefining the marriage that had been born from a cold contract, and that, in the midst of pain, had been transformed into a mission. For Beatriz, it was not only the victory against a criminal network, but proof that her destiny was not to blindly obey the rules others had written for her. Whether in the convent or in a contract signed under blackmail, her destiny was to choose, and for the first time, she would choose for herself. Her bond with Alessandro had also changed. The man who once mocked her faith now looked at her with respect, almost reverence. He still did not believe in miracles, but he could no longer deny the invisible force that had sustained Beatriz through every moment of danger. "Perhaps God exists after all, and sent you to prove it to me," he murmured one silent night. Surprising even himself, Beatriz smiled through tears, because she knew she did not need to convert him with words. Her life, her courage, and her devotion had already done so without her realizing it. Yet their love also needed to be rebuilt. It was no longer the tension of repressed bodies or the weight of a broken vow. It was something beyond that, more mature, born from the complicity of a struggle that demanded sacrifices and renunciations. Alessandro, for the first time, no longer saw Beatriz as possession, but as an equal. And Beatriz, without denying her faith, accepted that loving this man was also part of her mission. The marriage that had begun as a prison now became a choice, not an imposed contract, but an alliance born from pain, transformed into hope. In the mansion's garden, now reopened as a shelter for orphans and survivors, Beatriz walked among the smiling girls. Her gaze reflected the serenity of someone who had lost much, yet gained even more. Alessandro watched her from a distance, proud, knowing that this woman was not only his wife, she was the flame that had reignited his humanity. The touch of their hands, when they finally met, was no longer one of possession, but of mutual surrender. Thus, a nun for a day, a wife for a year, ceased to be merely the cruel title of a contract and became something greater, the story of a woman who, torn from her faith, discovered that her true mission was to unite love and justice, body and spirit, faith and courage. And alongside a man who once rejected everything he could not control, she showed that even the hardest heart can be redeemed when it finds a greater purpose.